cloud waves break. Between the suns sinking behind my lake, shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle the skies. But stranger still is lost Carcosa. Songs that the Hyenes shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die and her in the dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die now, unsung, as tears unshed shall dry and die in lost Carcosa.
Robert William Chambers was born in 1865, and he was a native of New York. He was born there in Brooklyn. He was the son of a lawyer, and he went to Paris to study painting in 1886. He was good friends with the American painter Charles Dana Gibson. I think they might have even lodged together. Gibson became quite celebrated for his painting, although I don't really know anything about it. But he also did some illustrations for Chambers, because though Chambers studied at the Académie Julienne in Paris for like 7 years, he never really amounted to much as a painter. But like Poe, he seems to have developed a real fascination with the French and French culture, and you see lots of references to it in his fiction. He wrote a number of novels and short stories dealing with either bohemian artists living in turn-of-the-century Paris or the Franco-Prussian War. And you see a lot of French quotes liberally sprinkled through his work, including this one. And his first novel was In the Quarter, published in 1894, which was directly inspired by his time in France, and specifically living as a struggling art student in Paris. Now, Robert Chambers had begun his writing career, and this career would last for a good 40 years. He wrote many, many novels and many short story collections, and he never stopped. And in general, he was a very, very well-selling author, but interestingly, he's now most known for The King in Yellow, and much of his later fiction is not really talked about today. But he wrote many novels and short stories in a lot of different genres: adventure, romance, espionage and war fiction, historical novels, only very occasionally dipped into the weird horror stuff, and also, I think, put out some humorous science fiction short stories with a emphasis on zoology, oddly enough. So essentially, he did whatever he thought the market demanded, and that was his thing. So I've read one of his later books, The Slayer of Souls. I've actually known about The King in Yellow for a really long time. I think I first discovered it maybe around 2003 or 4 or something like that.
Yeah, this one was a relatively new one for me, and I'm kind of amazed I'd never heard about it until now, because it has a very wide reach.
Yeah, it really, really does. And it's fascinating because while it does have a wide reach, there's only certain things about it that have had a wide reach, and they seem to have been, I don't know, it's interesting what exactly has been taken away from the concept, and obviously inspired many future writers. But in order to get there, we need to talk about the concept of the actual play. I think, though, that what we should do is just mention that this story, The Repairer of Reputations, is the very first story in the anthology The King in Yellow. And we'll talk a bit about the book The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers as opposed to the book The King in Yellow that is in the stories of The King in Yellow, which is an unknown book. And it's actually a play.
Yeah.
The play is a play that was written in Paris, supposedly, and was internationally distributed and banned in many places. Now, there's some interesting effects that this play has on the people that read it. The story Repair Reputations is the first of 4 stories in the anthology that are loosely connected. Certain characters are mentioned again, but nobody really that's directly involved. Like, the stories do stand on their own quite well. They don't form a cohesive whole or anything like that. But it seems to be essentially 4 stories describing what influence the King in Yellow play has had on society, starting in the 1890s and working all the way to 1920, which is the year in which our story, Repair of Reputations, takes place. The book contains 10 stories total, and the rest of them are not concerned with the play at all. So it's essentially 4 stories concerning the play. There's a weird sort of prose poem. There is a time travel romance story that doesn't have any actual real science fictional content, but it is a time travel romance story, so I suppose it's of some interest. And then there's a few Franco-Prussian War story about American expatriates and stuff. So, I mean, all in all, I suppose genre interest varies. H.P. Lovecraft famously said that he only really liked the really weird stories, of course. I don't know. I think that a couple of the later ones are actually pretty good. There's a really neat, really short ghost story in there that I think is pretty good.
Yeah, I'm certainly interested to read the rest because I really like this one, as we will see.
Yeah, it's really good. And it starts with a quote in French, and it says, "Ne rayons pas les fous. Leur folie dure plus longtemps que la nôtre. Voilà toute la différence." And in English, I think that roughly translates to, "Do not mock the insane. Their madness merely lasts longer than ours. That is the only difference." And we begin with a document of what has happened in the world, and specifically in America, in the 25 years since this story was written. In Europe, war has unfortunately torn many of the nations asunder, and Russia has quietly rumbled in like a beast and claimed most of the land. In America, however, many of the questions and problems of the day have been settled in one way or another. These include the black problem, the Indian problem, and the religion problem. And the tale reports that things are tranquil and people are happy. The foreigners have all been kicked out of New York. That ugly Statue of Liberty removed. New York City is full of parks now instead of those awful cafes. Suicide is now not only legal but encouraged for those who cannot bear the burden of a worthy existence. There was a war with Germany over Samoa, and an abortive and somewhat comical-sounding invasion of New Jersey was undertaken by the Germans, who were pushed back by the mighty navy of the United States of America. The United States owns many imperial investments in the Pacific and Africa. The Army's ranks swell. Chicago rises like a phoenix, white and imperial. I think what we have here is a perfectly functional fascist ethno-state.
Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like. And it's interesting that he sets it up like this because it doesn't really seem to play any effect in the story other than just like the setting. I don't know if it factors into other stories in the anthology, but this whole background we get is just this like weird dystopia that this whole, I guess, series of events unfolds in. And we do see some of the suicide chambers in use later on, but a lot of the background stuff that we're given up front just doesn't play into it. So it's interesting that he chose to include that stuff.
I think that it plays into it. I think that it plays into it in a subtle way. No, it doesn't actually come into the other stories, because this is the one This is the latest one in terms of time period. The others seem to be, more or less contemporaneous to the time of writing.
Yeah.
But at that time, the play has already started to circulate. Now, this is 1920. This is a time when the play has been a notorious book for 25 years. So I think I want to return to this topic of what the background means to the story later on.
Okay.
But the arts are subsidized. They say it's just like old Europe. And there's more stuff about bigotry and intolerance being laid in their grave. And it does seem very much like propaganda. And it's awesome because not only is it propaganda, but it's also world building. So it's kind of maybe not the most fluid thing to have it just like thrown at you right at the beginning like that. But I think in this story, it actually really works.
Yeah.
I like the way it's delivered. It's concise. And within a few paragraphs, you sort of know what kind of place you are in. And this New York, give me old dirty New York. Like this New York it might be clean and pristine, but it doesn't seem it doesn't seem like a very nice place to hang out in. So, but we focus on a single individual in this new world, one Mr. Hildred Castaigne, who, yes, lives in New York and is the voice of our story. He is recently released from a mental hospital where he judges he has been unjustly imprisoned, as his mind is sound. In fact, better than it was 4 years before, when he fell from his horse and injured himself. That was thought to have caused his madness. Now, the biggest thing that Castaigne has learned during his convalescence, he says, is ambition. While recovering, he decides to read The King in Yellow after some trepidation. Now, I am going to read what he says here. Though Castaigne, he feels very confident and in charge of his circumstances, he's haunted and troubled by the play. This is a paragraph describing his reactions to the play. During my convalescence, I had bought and read for the first time The King in Yellow. I remember after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred grate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it, but as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, or perhaps it was of joy so poignant that I suffered in every nerve, I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read and reread it, and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. This is the thing that troubles me, for I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, when the twin suns sink into the lake of Hali, and my mind will bear forever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer, as the writer has cursed the world with this beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth, a world which now trembles before the King in Yellow. When the French government seized the translated copies which had just arrived in Paris, London, of course, became eager to read it. It is well known how the book spread like an infectious disease, from city to city, from continent to continent, barred out here, confiscated there, denounced by press and pulpit, censured even by the most advanced of literary anarchists. No definite principles had been violated in those wicked pages, no doctrine promulgated, no convictions outraged. It could not be judged by any known standard. Yet although it was acknowledged that the supreme note of art had been struck in The King in Yellow, all felt that human nature could not bear the strain, nor thrive on words in which the essence of purest poison lurked. The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterward with more awful effect. So I think there you have pretty much all you really need to know about The King in Yellow.
Yeah.
There are little hints sprinkled throughout these 4 stories, but that one couple of paragraphs really gets to the heart of what this whole thing is about. And we never see anything beyond Act 1. It's just hinted at throughout those 4 stories that that is when things get really terrible. There are a few quotes from Act 1, like the poem that precedes this installment of Chrononauts, which was read earlier. But other than that, it's just hints. Now, on a fine day in April of 1920, the first suicide chamber is opened at Washington Square, between Wooster Street and Fifth Avenue. By the great doors is a painting of The Fates by American expatriate in Paris, Boris Yvain, R.I.P. He's featured in the next story, The Mask. The opening is marked by great ceremony and lots of military pomp. The laws prohibiting suicide and providing punishment for any attempt at self-destruction have been repealed. The government has seen fit to acknowledge the right of man to end an existence which may have become intolerable to him. Through physical suffering or mental despair, it is believed that the community will be benefited by the removal of such people from their midst. Since the passage of this law, the number of suicides in the United States has not increased. Now the government has determined to establish a lethal chamber in every city, town, and village in the country. It remains to be seen whether or not that class of human creatures from whose desponding ranks new victims of self-destruction fall daily will accept the relief thus provided. So says the governor of New York. An easy solution for a state like this is you don't want burdens on society. Just encourage them to get rid of themselves, and you solve a lot of your problems. It's genius. So Castaigne watches this parade on display of the opening day, and he stops in at Hawberk the armorer's shop. He has an interest in Hawberk's daughter, though he quickly points out that it isn't a romantic interest at all. But she mustn't marry his cousin, Louis. But she is engaged to him, so this could present a problem. Louis is a proud military man, and Constance hopes to see him at the ceremony. But Castaigne dismisses him, saying the Legion is off in maneuver somewhere else, and this turns out to be not true, and this is one of the things that makes Castaigne seethe, but he keeps it under wraps. He can't help but be mesmerized, however, by the sound of the smith's hammer. He has bigger fish to fry, but is drawn by the clash of steel and its gleam. Hawberk is working on an old suit of armor from the 15th century, and he relates its history, and this perks Castaigne's interest a little. Lunatic, in the words of Hawberk, lives upstairs. Just so happens it's one of the 3 people Castaigne needs to see in this house. You see, they have a thing together. Castaigne maintains that Mr. Wilde is not only strong of mind, but possessed of great historical knowledge and secrets. Hawberk doesn't believe any of this nonsense. When biting back his anger, Castaigne, he reveals a secret, the location of the greave of the armor that's missing from the suit that Hawberk is working on. He says it can be found in some theatrical boat hole somewhere, some storage room. He says Mr. Wilde has this knowledge, and he appears to know things about the Hawberk family which causes disquiet among father and daughter.
Yeah, I think he calls him a marquis or something like that.
Yeah, the Marquis of Avonshire.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is just a made-up place name.
Right.
But it ties into this whole motif of this story that centers around lineage and ascension and stuff like that. And supposedly he knows that Hawberk killed somebody who, I guess, molested his wife or something like that, and he's been on the run ever since, is what's hinted at. They neither confirm or deny this, though. Mr. Wilde is this weird, withered figure with artificial ears who hangs out in his apartment with a vicious cat who hates him.
There's definitely evidence of that fact all over his body.
Yeah. Like, they have actual fights with each other, and they roll around in the apartment howling, so no wonder Hawberk thinks he's a lunatic. Mr. Wilde's kind of like a spider in his lair, kind of what it feels like. And he runs something he calls a reputation repair business. And they go over the books, and Mr. Wilde seems confident. He's received a few retainers for his services, so he's already quite wealthy. Castaigne is fascinated by some of Wilde's manuscripts, especially the bound copy of the Imperial Dynasty of America, which he has read many, many times. He believes he will soon be the inheritor of great, great power. As the cat threatens his life, Wilde muses to Castaigne about the latter's rightful ambitions and goals, including the demise of one Dr. Archer, who's the name of the physician whose asylum Castaigne was staying in for a period of several years. He talks about the coming revolution and says, even though the Northwest and California may not bow to their will, the yellow sign shouldn't have to be employed. It is a problem that Constance loves Lewis, though. Castaigne wanders outside and finds that Lewis's regiment is in town, after all, and Wilde says that it's time there's a confrontation of some kind between them.
Yeah.
And the regiment is described as a fine lot of fellows. Castaigne admires the pomp. He has rooms at the Bedwick Hotel in town, and in his rooms there he has a safe, a real big safe with a huge steel door with a lock on it. And he obsesses over this thing, and it contains a crown. Not the king in yellows, but that of his loyal servant. And he cradles this crown until the alarm sounds on the time lock, indicating that he must put it back in its protective womb. This is a ritual Castaigne likes to do often when he's at home. He watches Washington Square and the lethal chamber, witnessing a man walking into his death, along with many bystanders who watch as this first, whether you can say victim or customer or
right.
I don't know, reaps the charity of the state. And Hildred goes for a walk, and this is where he meets Lewis in all his finery. And Mr. Wilde's name is mentioned in conversation, and of course Lewis has to annoy Hildred with talking about his lunacy. Hildred really hates that word, lunatic, and crazy. He can't stand those words. Lewis requests to go see Hallberg, and a whole bunch of them get into a cab and head out for the harbor where the fleet is on display. And Lewis points out and names all the ships proudly. And Lewis and Constance, obviously smitten with each other, go for a walk. And Hallberg admits to Hildred that Wilde was right about the tassets and cuissard from the armor's location. Hallberg wants to reward Wilde with some of the money he will make, but Hildred angrily rebuffs him, saying Wilde and Hildred himself will soon be extremely rich, and that neither credit nor charity is desired. He starts to go off the rails a bit and rant, but cuts himself off, simply finishing with, "You will see." And Hallberg makes Hildred seethe again with his obvious pity and declaration that Hildred should go for a country vacation. Hallberg reflects sadly on how Hildred used to be fond of sports, but now immerses himself in musty books all day. And some time passes, and one morning in early May, Hildred he's doing his crown ritual thing again, and he's gazing at himself in the mirror wearing the jeweled crown, thinking of the awful end of the first act of The King in Yellow and the streets of Carcosa, and he's overcome and defies the alarm bell, repeating, entranced, "The day has come!
Yeah.
The day has come!" And he's interrupted suddenly by Lewis, who's just come in unannounced, and he actually pulls a knife on him. But Lewis is like, "What's going on here? Why are you wearing that cheap piece of shit?" He doesn't say that, but that's pretty much what he's thinking.
Right, yeah.
And the safe just looks like some crappy old bread box, and it's this dime store brass crown, and he obviously
Like glued
thinks
together
that,
with paste and stuff.
yeah, and he obviously thinks Hildred is cracked.
Yeah.
And Hildred decides it is best to humor him, like he's the madman. And Lewis criticizes Hildred for his bad brandy and reading choices, mostly Napoleon, apparently. He's lots and lots of books on or by Napoleon, I guess. And Hildred challenges that he also has The King in Yellow. And Lewis has never read it and says he doesn't want to be driven crazy. And Lewis changes the subject. And he says he's going to marry Constance tomorrow, before the regiment sets off unexpectedly early. Before Lewis leaves, Hildred makes him promise to meet him at midnight in the park. And Hildred rushes to Mr. Wilde. And here we have a very strange scene. Mr. Wilde's had a particularly bloody altercation with his feline antagonist, and he's a real mess. And Hildred grabs a hatchet, and he wants to go kill the cat, but he can't find her. And once again, Wilde he picks himself up, and he starts poring over the ledger, And Hildred reads the Imperial Dynasty of America again, but somehow Wilde's been hiding a man in the apartment. And this guy just sort of comes out of the bedroom,
Yeah.
and he's this very timid and wrecked-seeming individual named Vance. And Vance babbles about Wilde and a madhouse and the King in Yellow before Wilde, physically subdues him. And according to the ledger, Vance is one of Wilde's clients, and he has served time in prison for forgery, and then he's been in the asylum, and it's not stopped him from embezzling money, though, which he is still doing ever since his release. So now Wilde has something on Vance, and they read him the Imperial Dynasty of America manuscript, and Vance seems to be very much under a spell of almost hypnosis, and they explain to Vance how the King in Yellow and the ancient ancestry of Carcosa linked somehow to the Imperial Dynasty of America, and they don't really explain how, but somehow, the lineage is there. And we take it on face value because the names would probably mean nothing to us as readers anyway. But Hildred Castaigne and Louis too, presumably, are declared to be cousins of the last king. And Louis must be exiled or killed so that Hildred can wear the crown. And Louis must never, ever marry, least of all the daughter of the Marquis of Avonshire. And all who receive the yellow sign must heed, or else. And Hildred signs a writ of execution, Hildred Rex. Vance will carry out the execution with a knife, and Hildred makes a last attempt to persuade Louis, who has just been promoted to captain, away from his goal of marriage. And he makes Louis read the Imperial Dynasty of America and the notes on it, and of course it means absolutely nothing to Louis. It's completely incomprehensible gibberish, and he's bored out of his mind. But then he stumbles across his name towards the end of the manuscript, along with Hildred's, which now makes him sort of take notice, and Louis doesn't seem to recognize the yellow sign, though, and this makes Hildred very angry. And Hildred tries to explain that Dr. Archer kept him in the asylum because he became aware of the imperial succession, and he wanted to take advantage somehow. And it turns out that Archer was visited by Hildred last night, and the interview was final. 3 more interviews will be conducted. And Louis must renounce the crown, and he must not marry. And Hildred pulls a knife on his cousin, and then all of a sudden Vance comes rushing, and he rushes for the suicide chamber, crying out madly, and Hildred laughs like a maniac, and he believes that the Hallbergs have been dealt with, and rushes up to Wilde. But Mr. Wilde doesn't seem to be around, but Hildred dons the crown and the robe with the yellow sign on it and basks in his newfound glory. That's when he hears a groan, and a cat rushes past. Hildred kills his cat and kills the cat with a knife, but Wilde is down. His throat's been torn open, and he dies. And that point is when Hildred's glory turns to despair, and then men show up and seize him, and he fights with the police and bites and scratches them, but he doesn't escape. And Hallberg and Louis still live. "Ah, I see it now! You have seized the throne in the Empire! Woe! Woe to you who are crowned with the crown of the King in Yellow!" And then at the end there's a nice little postscript that says that Hildred died in a criminal insane institution. And then we have our story, the repair of reputation. So there is a lot packed into this.
Yeah, there definitely is.
Story.
Yeah.
There's a ton of stuff, as well as the world building. There's the whole aspect of the play The King in Yellow that's brought into this, and there is the weird family drama going on. There's all kinds of stuff in here, and the suicide chambers, of course. So I guess one thing that's pretty clear is that, of course, we are dealing with an unreliable narrator.
Right, yeah. I mean, that is what seems to be mentioned the most in the criticism I've seen of this story, is that element of you really never know what is going on in the narrator's head and what is in the real world. He's wearing a crown of brass and paste, and he was clearly taken advantage of by this Wilde character. And
it would seem so.
Yeah, and it seems like he does this often.
So essentially, what I think, and admittedly I have read the other 3 stories, but I do think that they stand alone well. And so essentially, though, the mental state of anyone who has read the play can't really be trusted.
Yeah.
Now, how much of their perception, like how much of that distorts perception, I don't know. One thing I will say about Hildred is perhaps it seems like he does accurately convey what other people are saying and doing.
Right, yeah.
That part maybe we can trust. It's just his own thought processes and his own actions that seem questionable.
Yeah.
In terms of, not questionable in terms of their morality or outcome, but in terms of their actual truth.
Right, right.
And there are various things throughout the story that kind of make you wonder about that. Like the fact that his seeing of the crown and stuff is nothing at all like what Lewis sees. And also the fact that he goes into the apartment of Mr. Wilde, and Mr. Wilde is all messed up from being attacked by the cat, and he looks for the cat, and he can't seem to find the cat, but nor does he find this person who's been hiding out in the bedroom this whole time.
Yeah, right.
It's almost like there's something there that maybe happened that we're not really aware of. The whole visit to Archer is also kind of glossed over at the end, so we wonder, so did he succeed at that, or did he fail? Well, the fact that he dies in a institute for the criminal insane would seem to suggest that maybe he succeeded.
Yes, certainly.
But, I mean, certainly none of the other murders went off the way they were supposed to.
Right.
Obviously, Vance has also read The King in Yellow, and Mr. Wilde has read The King in Yellow. Now, my wondering is, how deep does this delusion go? And does everyone who has read the play, do they all share the same delusion, or is it different?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard for me to say since I haven't read the other stories, but you said Wilde doesn't factor into the other ones, right?
No,
so, I mean,
none of the characters do. The only one who is mentioned, oddly enough, is this Boris Ivan, who's the artist who painted the picture of the Fates.
Yeah.
He is in the next story.
Okay.
He's like the main character, but nothing else really ties these together, except the play.
Yeah, Wilde to me seemed conscious of his actions in doing this, and he seemed like he was not with the best of intentions, but he seemed to know what he was doing in a way that reality seemed both beyond the narrator and Vance.
Maybe, but I don't know. I mean,
I guess we don't
claims.
know because, the narrator here is unreliable, and I guess technically Wilde could be somebody else that as...
Yeah, I mean, he claims to have like an army of 10,000 men, right? Like he says that he can basically call up all these men as soon as they're needed, presumably so that Hildred can take control of the United States and then the world.
Right, but I mean, at the same time, he could be stringing these people on. And trying to take advantage of their financial assets, trying to take advantage of whatever he can pull out of them.
There's an interesting return of our old friend phrenology when Lewis comments on Wilde's head. He says that he has the head of a criminally insane person.
Right.
Yeah. Still a thing in 1895.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and long after that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I wonder about it. It is the thing that has caused this book, The King in the Yellow, to become so important in horror literature especially. And this is a horror story. This is, to make no mistake.
Yeah, primarily. And I think the only really science fiction trappings you could put on it are the futuristic dystopian, I would even call it a proto-fascist setting.
Yeah, I mean, the word fascist hadn't even been used yet, but it's clear that that's what it feels like.
Absolutely,
to us.
And this is definite military fascism, like troops marching down the streets, and there's a heavy military presence throughout the entirety of New York City. And they make a point to say that the old New York of the 1870s, 1880s has been gone for a while now, and it's just been replaced with this dry, stale,
clean.
Right, exactly, sanitized even, military state. The rest of the story is definitely not science fiction in the fact that it doesn't really go into any of the tropes or settings or devices that we would see in science fiction.
The play, The King in Yellow, does seem to be about some kind of alien civilization.
Yeah.
It is mentioned there are multiple moons, twin suns,
right,
strange water bodies, and this lost city of Carcosa, which is, he actually borrowed that from Ambrose Bierce.
Hmm.
Ambrose Bierce wrote a story called An Inhabitant of Carcosa, and that story is just described as an ancient city. It's not quite as strange as Chambers makes it, but he's borrowed that from Bierce and made it sort of so that this play would seem to take place on another world. And so to me, that is also kind of a, if not a science fictional aspect, definitely a weird fictional aspect. And what I was getting at was like the reason the book is considered important is that aspect. And it is an aspect of the play and how it shapes men's minds. And you see that in Lovecraft in a sort of a different way. And, the Necronomicon, obviously, like you read that book, you're not long for this world.
Right.
You're either going to get carried off by some kind of tentacled monster, or you're just going to lose your mind and like go insane.
It also kind of reminded me of the Monty Python sketch where they write the funniest joke in the world.
Yeah,
that's
the
so
killing
funny.
joke.
Yeah,
yeah. And the Germans have their own version of the...
Right, yeah.
I won't repeat it here.
Yeah.
Because it's really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that for sure is a thing. And also, many later works would seem to draw from this, the idea of a text that can actually pollute you, mess up your mind. You see that in, like, John Carpenter, in The Mouth of Madness, even perhaps Borges and a story... Toulon Okbar Orbis Tertius, which is maybe something we'll cover later. Maybe. I don't know. I thought about it. It's sort of a science fiction story, I think.
Yeah, I haven't read that one, but any excuse to cover him I'd be down for, so.
Yeah, it's actually in the big book of science fiction, so.
Oh, there you go.
There's some legitimacy to
Sure.
But, like, I mean, we were covering a couple of entries here that are sort of tangentially science fiction, and I do think that this, like, there are aspects of this. There's the dystopia, for one thing, but there is also, like that whole aspect of the play has this alluring strangeness to it. And I also, we talked about the play and the possible delusion that the people who have read the play might share. Like maybe they have this in common and they all recognize the yellow sign. So another thing that I think that you see this reflected in is like conspiracy narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Like all these people have been touched by something. They all recognize this symbol of the yellow sign. And maybe they are waiting for a ruler to come and control the entire empire, so to speak, in the name
of Napoleon.
Yes, like Napoleon, exactly. In the name of the Yellow King.
Right.
Now, and the Yellow King... he wears the pallid mask. He seems perhaps like he would represent death. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if, because this is the latest story in the series of the four, he put this at the beginning, but this is the latest one. So my feeling on this maybe is that this is what will happen if the play hangs around for long enough and gets to enough people. We will live in a dystopia like this one.
It just corrupts the entire moral fabric of society, and it turns into evil, oppressive military rule.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that to me is something that just sort of occurred to me on this last reading, because I read this story a few times, right? But, it really occurred to me that, hey, maybe everybody has pretty much read the play at this point, except for a few people like Lewis who are just like, no, man, I don't want to lose my mind. But it's the kind of thing where
or then, I mean, if it doesn't even need to be that many people if you think about it. No. If you put the right amount of people in the right positions that are bad faith actors, they can manipulate the system in incredibly efficient and startlingly profound ways. And, I don't want to draw too many parallels to real world events here, but I think you could see very many examples of that happening in not just the United States, but plenty of places in Europe over the last 5 or 10 years where certain norms of our society have been eroded. And so I don't think it would necessarily take an entire society of reading The King in Yellow and have everybody in the United States be brainwashed. Right. Yeah.
Certain important people.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the kind of thing where, most people who believe themselves to be sharp intellectuals would want to read, because the more you hear about how dangerous it is, the more you would be like, oh, geez, I got to find out. Find out. My mind is strong enough. Of course, Lewis, he may be, obviously Hildred doesn't like him, but he seems like he may be a quite well-meaning person, but he's definitely not an intellectual.
Right.
So it's totally not in his interest. But
Yeah,
he's going
right.
to follow the orders that he's been given because he is a soldier.
Mhm.
And so the orders that he will be given will be to further America and its increasing sway over the world and its promulgation of new wonderful ideologies like state-sanctioned suicide.
Sure. Yeah.
It's great. And then, yeah, you were drawing parallels to the modern day. I mean, it kind of occurred to me, too. Like, if Mr. Wilde had social media, that would just be, like, perfect, right?
Oh, of course. And I mean, he doesn't even need social media. Personality cults have existed all throughout the 20th century. I mean, look at Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy. They're all societies that were rapidly transformed over the course of just a couple years by a very few people that were saying things over and over again to shift the cultural norms and perspectives of an entire nation of people. And
Yeah.
it seems like such a drastic shift that would maybe take decades or even centuries, but in real life, it just happens much
Quickly.
quicker than that. And
Yeah. And it's so easy to just sort of sit back and not really take notice until it's too late.
right, exactly. And the date of this story takes place in 1920 and was written in 1895, and presumably the other stories in The King in Yellow take place in the present day.
They're all in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, presumably the shift to United States fascism would occur in a similar way of
Yeah.
rapid military buildup due to the recent war in text with Germany, which it's interesting the real world parallels this has with the next couple decades because this was before World War One by quite some time.
But Chambers himself would have been experiencing the after effects of the Franco-Prussian War, which he
Well,
wrote
that
about
and yeah,
extensively.
the Bismarck and the unification of Germany and the militarism and nationalism that was associated with it, I think, yeah, would have been very present in his mind.
Yeah, and that is one thing I wanted to comment on is, yeah, you're right. The way the world building part at the beginning, which is that kind of like at first clumsy, but in terms of how it works with the story, pretty awesome way of introducing this world.
Yeah,
There are dates given for a lot of things, and it starts pretty much right after the book is written. So,
right.
these changes start happening around, like, I think the first date given is like 1897 or something. I think that's when they tore down the statue, if I'm not mistaken. But that was like the first date given, and so there's a few other dates given too. So we're not talking like this isn't 300 years hence. Like this starts happening now.
Right.
At the time
Right.
that I am writing this
Yeah.
is when all this is starting.
Yeah.
And by 1920, this is where we're at. I love that. I think that's just so immediate and so like, all right, so next year, this is going to happen.
Yeah,
and,
right.
You know,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I think that's great.
And I mean, I guess at first it seems far-fetched, but you're looking at a generation of readership where the Civil War is still very much in recent memory.
Yeah. And to me, it doesn't really, like, we're going to do some stuff on more dystopias at some point. And one book that we talked about covering was It Can't Happen Here by St. Clair Lewis. And it's a very long novel which describes exactly how a fascist takeover of the United States would work.
Yeah.
And it's more grounded in so-called realism than this, although some people have said otherwise because they've maintained that the system of checks and balances in the U.S. government would prevent such a thing from ever happening.
Yeah.
But I don't know about that.
Right.
No, I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't read that one. I've read Babbitt, which I really enjoyed. But from what I understand, that particular novel was basically him reacting to Huey Long and his rise of popularity. And Huey Long never really made it to the level of prominence that he aspired to because somebody shot him and killed him.
Well, there you go.
So
He could have.
yeah.
Yeah, that sometimes happens to Nazis. They got shot and killed before something that happened to George Lincoln Rockwell as well. So
Right. Yeah, Huey Long wasn't a Nazi, but he was a very interesting figure, which I guess a populist socialist. His slogan was share our wealth. But Long was very authoritarian in his approach, and it scared the shit out of a lot of people. And I guess there's speculation that the populism and his commitment to socialism and being for the working man was just really all a sham. and he was just really in it for power for himself, which is kind of how he conducted his ways.
Yeah, it's how a lot of these people take power, right?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, somebody did shoot him and kill him, so it never really got beyond the local level of governorship of Louisiana. But he definitely had national ambitions, and it definitely scared Sinclair Lewis enough to write that novel about what he thought that a regime like that under him would look like.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't know enough about the actual American history involved, but I was certainly taken by the aspects of the story, and it's a fairly lengthy book, but it's good. So
yeah,
to me, that's like it does seem like people were worried pre-Second World War about the way the United States could go.
Sure.
And maybe after the war, people forgot about this for a little while, but it's always kind of been a looming specter. So another thing I liked, there's a lot of great descriptions of New York in here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like he obviously lived there and knew it pretty well.
Right. So this reminded me a little bit, I mean, it has no similarities to the stories and authors otherwise, but Edith Wharton's novels, specifically The Age of Innocence and The House of Mirth, where she's talking about old New York, and old New York to her is the New York of the 1870s and 80s.
Right.
And the way that New York acts as a character in both this story and her novels, and how it's constantly changing through the years, because it was a little after Repair of Reputations and around the time that Wharton was writing, where New York's rapid development in terms of growing upwards. So the elevator, which was new technology, enabled the development of skyscrapers. And since New York is a relatively small city area-wise, the best place to grow is upwards, if you can do it. So before the elevator, it wasn't practical to have buildings beyond like 4 or 5 stories high. But when you have a device that could send you 50 stories, well, why not make buildings that high too? So that's what happened in the early 20th century, and massive areas of the city were totally rebuilt to accommodate the ability to grow the city upwards, as well as more populations coming in, and more people mean more growth, and more growth means more people, and it just kind of feeds back on one another to the enormous city that we have today. But this all happened over the course of a couple decades, and they both comment on that civil engineering changes that would bring developments to the city that would fundamentally change how it functions.
Yeah. This one has it moving in quite a different direction, rather than he doesn't really talk so much about building upward.
Right.
It's more like, well, we need to get rid of the undesirable elements that are here.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And make the popular. It's a very Anglo-Saxon sort of.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely explicitly specified that it's a white Christian ethno-state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when they say that the religious problem has been dealt with, they probably mean, well, I mean, okay, so Jews are specifically mentioned in the story.
Yeah,
they got rid of most of the Jews that were in New York somehow.
Right.
It's not gone into how, it's not said that it's violent necessarily, but you kind of maybe get that impression.
Sure.
I think that a lot of the time when they say, like, now there's religious tolerance, I think they probably mean between Protestants and Catholics of various kinds and stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's like, bigotry and intolerance have been put in their graves, and it's again, it's more propaganda.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So the last thing I wanted to bring up was the postscript. I don't like it. I wish it wasn't there.
Him dying in asylum, you mean?
Yeah. I just don't think that it's necessary. I wish that the story just ended with him screaming.
Yeah.
Woe to you, crowned with the crown of the king!
Yeah,
I just wished it was ended like that.
Yeah,
and in fact...
So this one reminded me of, I'm not going to say the title of the novel, in case any of you want to read it, and it's going to be a major spoiler, but it's a very long Scandinavian novel, about 1,000 pages long, and the very end of it is exactly like this, where it's like, oh yeah, by the way, 30 years later, the main character dies of the plague.
Wow. Yeah. No, I don't like it. When I actually read this to my ex for the first time, I just didn't say that part.
Right, yeah.
Because I just didn't.
Yeah.
Sorry. But no, I just didn't want to.
It does kill the momentum, man. If it ended there with him.
At least it's short.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
It's that. And again, is part of kind of, like, I didn't want it to be long, but also the fact that it's so short just makes it so throwaway.
Right, yeah.
Not even, it's like just this very casual, nondescript sentence saying, he died in this criminal insane institute.
Right.
That's I don't know. I don't like that part. But otherwise, This is a fantastic story.
I agree. This is, I don't want to give it away, but this is the best one of the episode for me. And I think maybe even the best of the stuff that we've covered on the podcast in general. Like, this really checked all the boxes for me, and I really love this from start to finish.
Yeah, and it's a real shame that Chambers never really went here again. And I don't mean the play, but I mean this kind of story.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't read too much of his other stuff. I read like one other book, and it wasn't, it was kind of one of those espionage kind of books. It had a little bit of strange Orientalist supernaturalism in it.
Right.
But which is sort of typical for like the early 20s, I guess.
Oh, absolutely.
But my friend told me about these weird zoological sci-fi stories that he did, which are very tongue-in-cheek. And there's also The Tracer of Lost Persons, which is like kind of a series of detective stories. It actually became a radio show in the 30s and 40s, I think. So Mr. Keen, The Tracer of Lost Persons. Certainly, like, there's some criticism of his stuff out there, but a lot of it maintains that this book is his masterpiece.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's easy to see why.
It is, and it's kind of one of these things that makes me think when artists are like young and hungry, they kind of do better as artists, even if they're not doing as well in terms of being comfortable, which is kind of sad.
Right.
Right? But that's the way it goes sometimes, I guess. Like, he became a very workmanlike writer who just did what he felt would sell. And it wasn't necessarily stories like this. The other three stories are good, but I think this one is my favorite. And it's also the longest.
Okay.
So all the stories in the book, including the non-King in Yellow stories, are quite short. And again, I enjoy even the kind of more romance-based sort of historical stories, but I don't think any of them quite match this one, The Mask and the Yellow Sign, especially. They're all good.
Yeah. Well, still, I'm definitely eager to check out the rest of the book, if not some of his other works, because he has a real talent here.
Yeah. We can say that it's a shame he never returned to this kind of degree of weirdness.
Yeah.
But at least we have this book. And,
absolutely.
There's a lot of contemporary references. There's whole anthologies that have actually been published with King in Yellow stories in them, written by other people. There's at least one or two of those.
Yeah.
The book is also referenced in the new TV series True Detective in a sort of a semi-direct way.
Huh. Yeah, I must have missed that. I watched all, I guess maybe 4 seasons now. I saw the first 3.
I'm not sure, but it was in the first season, which is
okay. Yeah,
the weird one. And I didn't watch the other ones actually, but
sure. All right. Yeah, I guess I might have to rewatch that now that I've read this.
Yeah, Raymond Chandler mentioned it at one point. He wrote a story called The King in Yellow. But his King in Yellow was actually a trumpet player. He was like, there's all involved with like gangsters and stuff like that. But he does mention the book in the story. Like he says, I once read a book called The King in Yellow. And Chandler was really sneaky like that. Like he criticized genre fiction a lot, especially science fiction, but he would sneak in little references to it in his stories, which made you realize that he did in fact read it. So
yeah, well, I mean, some of the deepest criticism comes from the fans.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that's a fault that people have sometimes when they read criticism and they're like, "Oh, that guy must not be a fan."
Yeah. Right.
But they say that all the time about like modern stuff, like. If you dare say shit about Star Wars or Doctor Who or whatever, you're obviously not a fan.
Right.
Like, you don't like everything under the umbrella? What's wrong with you? Yeah, like, I don't know. But there's a lot of references. There's a lot of musical references, for sure. We were talking about the band Root.
Oh, yes.
From Czech Republic.
Yeah.
They have a song, Casilda's song, which takes lyrics directly from the poem at the beginning of The King in Yellow. And a lot of other references, too. I think in metal and elsewhere. So yeah, very, very cool. And I'm glad that we covered this.
We
absolutely. Probably won't come back to Chambers because I don't think he's very significant in science fiction otherwise. But this was a great story to cover.
Yep, I agree.
And I'm glad that we did it. I've been spoiled lately. Last time we did A Voyage to Arcturus. Now we did this story. These are two things that have been favorites for quite a number of years now. So
well, I'm certainly not complaining.
Yeah. So what are we covering next?
I believe we're going to go to Spain, and we're going to cover the work Future Story by an author who went by the pen name of Claudine.